You think you know the world, don't you? You read the headlines, you scroll past the images, you form your opinions. And like most people in the West, I thought I had a grip on what was happening in Palestine. Violence, victimhood, politics, I thought I understood. But stepping foot on that land shattered every lazy assumption I'd ever held. I didn't go there seeking God. I went interrogate reality. I went armed with skepticism, questions, and yes, a touch of arrogance. I thought I was there to confront their truths. I didn't realize mine would be the ones on trial. The moment I arrived, something felt off, not in the way I expected, but in a way that gnawed at me. People smiled, not because life was easy, but because they had something I couldn't quite define. I saw children laughing near military checkpoints. I saw elderly men sipping tea like the world hadn't collapsed around them. I saw mothers walking to mosques with serenity, not fear. And I thought, how can people have such grace when the world has given them every reason to despair? So I asked, I pushed, I challenged, and again, the answer came not in words, but in actions, in the way they prayed, in the way they carried dignity like a badge. I went there to find fault, but instead I found faith, not the soft, sentimental kind we politely nod to on Christmas, but a living, breathing force that shapes every action, every thought, every moment. And I couldn't help but ask myself, if this is what belief looks like under pressure, what excuse do I have for not believing at all? That's when the shift began. Not in my mind, but my soul. You don't truly understand the power of faith until you see it tested. Not in a cathedral or a church on Sunday morning, where belief is easy and convenient, but in the ashes of bombed-out buildings, in the stillness between sirens, where death is an uninvited guest and survival itself is an act of defiance. That's where I saw Islam, not in words, but in its most unshakable form practiced in the face of fire. I watched men roll out their prayer mats on broken concrete. I watched women raise their hands to the sky while drones hummed overhead. Not once did I see panic. Not once did I hear bitterness. What I witnessed was control, internal, spiritual control that didn't waver even as the world around them cracked open. You want to talk about strength? That's it. That's the kind of resilience you can't fabricate with slogans or politics. That kind of conviction is forged in something far deeper than fear or tradition. It's faith with a spine, and that shook me. Because here I was, a man with every freedom in the world, platform, passport, privilege, yet often crippled by doubt. I saw people who had nothing by Western standards walk with more peace than most CEOs, and I began to realizing perhaps we've confused comfort for clarity. Perhaps true freedom is in the absence of danger, but the presence of purpose. They didn't flinch. They prayed. And in those moments, I didn't see religion. I saw power, a power I couldn't explain but couldn't deny. And in that contrast between their certainty and my confusion, I understood just how bankrupt a life without belief can feel. I didn't go there to be humbled, but I was. We live in an age where headlines are designed to make us feel something before we understand anything. I've spent decades in media. I know how the sausage is made, the filters, the narratives, the careful omissions. So when I went to Palestine, I thought I knew what to expect. I'd read the reports, seen footage, heard the commentary. I arrived prepared to spot the dysfunction, the division, the supposed danger. But what I found was something none of those headlines ever bothered to mention: humanity. And not just any humanity, but one laced with dignity, depth, and extraordinary discipline. There were no press briefings, no curated stories, just life, raw, unfiltered, and utterly compelling. A boy offered me bread with a smile bigger than his frame. An old man invited me into his home, poured tea, and shared stories with more warmth than any boardroom I've ever sat in. No PR teams, no pretense, just generosity that expected nothing in return. These were people who had every reason to be bitter, yet chose grace. And it stopped me cold. Because in the West, we've been conditioned to look down on them. Uncivilized, oppressed, angry. That's the script, that's the lazy framing. But the truth is, I saw more civility in a Gaza alleyway than I have in some of those most advanced cities. More self-respect, more mutual respect. They weren't performing, and they were living, and they were doing it with honor. The media gave me sound bites, but Palestine gave me silence, the kind that makes you think, really think. And when that silence met their sincerity, I realized I hadn't just missed the full story, I'd missed the entire point. I wasn't there to witness conflict. I was there to rediscover character. We throw the word religion around so casually in the West, as if it's just a checkbox on a census form or a decorative ornament during holidays. But in Palestine, I didn't see religion. I saw a way of life, a code, a rhythm, a system so precise and purposeful that it made our so-called modern routines look like chaos in comparison. Islam wasn't something people casually claimed. It was something they embodied. with an intensity that was almost unnerving in its clarity. 5 times a day, everything stopped. Not for show, not for fear, but because time itself bowed to something higher. I watched men interrupt conversations mid-sentence, step aside from work, and align shoulder to shoulder in silence and submission. Not a forced submission, but a chosen one. And that hit me hard because we pride ourselves on independence, on freedom, on doing what we want when we want. But what I saw was freedom of another kind, the kind that comes from knowing exactly why you're here and what you stand for. Children weren't obsessed with screens, economies. They were learning Quran, not of compulsion, but curiosity. Teenagers weren't lost in identity crises. They walked with a sense of place, of lineage, of discipline that's vanishing fast in Western cities. The family wasn't a burden, it wasn't bond. The elderly weren't sidelined, they were revered. There was order, not just in how people dressed or prayed, but in how they treated time, money, food, neighbors, everything. And I started to wonder, maybe we've spent so long breaking rules in the name of freedom that we've forgotten the value of structure. Maybe we've mistaken rebellion for evolution, because what I saw in Islam wasn't restriction, it was direction. And in a world that's lost its compass, that looked a lot like salvation. There's a haunting realization you come to when you travel outside your echo chamber. It's that the world you thought was ahead might actually be the one falling behind. In the West, we pride ourselves on progress. We parade our freedom, our technology, our so-called enlightenment. But somewhere along the way, we traded depth for distraction, purpose for pleasure, and tradition for trend. And standing in the heart of Palestine, watching people clinging to something bigger than themselves, I began to see it. Maybe they're not the ones in crisis. Maybe we are. I watched young men walk to the mosque before dawn, while most of us back home still glued to screens at 2 a.m. I saw families who actually sat together, spoke together, prayed together. Not because it was culturally expected, but because it was spiritually essential. Meanwhile, we're over here debating whether families even matter anymore. We call it progress, but I'm beginning to wonder progress towards what? In Palestine, values weren't up for negotiation. Honor wasn't old-fashioned. Discipline wasn't oppressive, and faith wasn't optional when times got hard. It was the foundation that held everything upright. And in that contrast, I saw just how shaky the ground has become beneath our own feet. We've become a civilization drunk on individualism, allergic to limits and less with self. We shout about being liberated, but from what? From responsibility, from truth. They weren't living in denial. They were living with direction. They hadn't abandoned tradition. They had anchored themselves to it. And as I stood among them, I couldn't help but think maybe we've mistaken their restraint for repression and our chaos for freedom. But in the calm of their conviction, I saw something we've lost and desperately need to find again. You don't convert to a religion like Islam on a whim, especially not someone like me. A journalist, a skeptic, someone whose entire career is built on asking uncomfortable questions and dismantling easy answers. So let me be clear, this wasn't an emotional reaction. It wasn't a response to sympathy or tragedy. It was the slow, undeniable realization that I had spent years walking past the truth. Not because it wasn't visible, but because I wasn't ready to see it. When I bowed my head in that first prayer, it wasn't about conformity. It wasn't about clarity. A kind I hadn't felt in decades. I didn't feel pressured. I didn't feel lost. I felt like I'd arrived at something I didn't know I was searching for. And I'll tell you this, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was quiet, deep. Private, the kind of moment that rearranges everything inside you without needing a single word. I had spent years chasing meaning in the noise. Politics, career, status. But in that stillness, economies, I found something more powerful than applause or headline-ease purpose. Not the kind that shifts with trends or elections, but the kind that sits under your skin and steadies you through every storm. I realized belief didn't make people weaker. It made them bulletproof. Because when you're anchored to something eternal, the temporary chaos of the world doesn't shake you anymore. This wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about finally becoming who I was always meant to be. And not because someone convinced me, but because I saw it in the way they lived, of the biggest economies, in the way they endured, in the way they loved. It wasn't a leap of faith, it was a homecoming. And I didn't choose it because I had to. I chose it because I couldn't ignore it any longer.